welcome once again to Sid Caudle. And Sid, you've been pounding the pavements. We mentioned that last week. But you've been getting some interesting responses. And I know you love it. You should have been an Encyclopedia Britannica salesman. You know, you've missed your calling.
Well, I've been a life insurance salesman for a lot of my life, and they say actually selling life insurance is the hardest thing to sell, because at least if you've got the Encyclopedia Britannica, then you've got something to show people, and you can say, look at this, look at this, look at this. With life insurance, it's just a concept you have to put into people's minds. But anyway, I mean, yeah, I've always been good at selling them, and I do consider that what we do in politics is another form of selling. And I tell people in the party, you've got to look at it as a sales exercise. You can't just think, oh, I'll send this out and everyone's going to respond. They're not. You've literally got to send it out and ring them up. Have you received it? What do you think? And so on and so forth.
Yeah, well, it's going to be interesting times on Thursday, of course, to see how much the Tories are going to be decimated. Well, we'll cover that next week, but we're going to do a couple of items here that are quite deep. We'll start off with one of them, the Cass report. And I want to ask a question. Is this turning the corner at last about the trans madness? It's got everywhere. It's insidious. Stonewall have really caught a cold on this one, and about time. They've managed to wheedle their way into schools, into government, into the NHS, to put their woke agendas, even to big business. And you'd think big business had a bit of common sense, but no. They came up with this beautiful argument by saying, you've got to appear pro LGBT. We'll come in and do an assessment. It'll cost you £2,500. And then you go on our top 100 list. I mean, come on, snake oil salesman.
Yes, I know. I mean, it's ridiculous. The Cass report was a massive step forward. But you see, the thing is, I remember my professor of biblical studies used to say, the truth will out. And what this is all about is the truth. And at the end of the day, we know God made man and woman. Only a man and a woman will ever produce a child. A man and a man will never produce a child, and neither will a woman and a woman. And a woman can pretend she's a man, but however much a woman pretends she's a man, she cannot produce a child with a woman. She can only produce a child with another man. And it's the same vice versa. I mean, a man can pretend he's a woman, but he hasn't got a womb and will never produce a child. I mean, that is reality. Now, and the thing is, when it comes to children, if they start giving children puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and even worse, surgery, and remove a womb from a woman because she wants to be a man, or remove a man's genitals because he wants to think he's a woman, they're not making a man into a woman. They're not making a woman into a man. All they're doing is effectively castrating them and making them infertile for the whole of their lives. And when you make a woman, when you make a young girl or a young man infertile, you're doing something terrible to their bodies, which is not surprising if a short while down the line, they greatly regret what's happened. And you have people like Keira Bell saying, how on earth did they allow that to be done to me when I was just 15 or 16? Why on earth didn't somebody who loved me come on and say, no, you mustn't do it. It's not in your interest. And this is basically what the Cass report is saying. It's not in the interest of young people to have these operations and have these hormones. And, thank God someone has finally told the truth that the media will listen to.
Yeah, media are culpable in this, much of it anyway. And how on earth it's got into schools and influenced the young mind is dreadful, Sid.
Yes, well, absolutely. Well, it's Stonewall and Mermaids, a combination of both of them, plus other organisations. That the most terrible thing is that all these organisations are funded by the state. So it's us that are funding these organisations to the tune of literally millions of pounds. Incredibly. I mean, churches don't get the sort of funding that Stonewall and Mermaids have been getting. Churches get maybe tax relief on donations, but Stonewall have been getting much more than that. They've been getting direct grants, and enormous amounts of money in direct grants.
There is indeed. Sid, we've got to move on. We're constrained already by time, but there we go. Let's talk about the Tory government for a short while anyway, until July, certain people say, or even November, who knows. But one of the things that is coming out plain and straightforward is the fact that countries that really prosper do not depend wholly on mega companies in their country. They depend on small businesses, which is the majority in the UK, and in many, many countries. And the small businesses have been treated very cruelly by a Tory government. It's unthinkable. If Labour had tried this on, there'd have been mayhem. What do I mean? Well, minimum wage increased in just over 3 years by nearly 40%. Now, come on, what's that about?
Well, yes, I agree. And we've had the VAT threshold, which was 85,000 for years, which in real terms should now be a minimum of 125,000. But it's now 90,000, and they say they're not increasing it above 90,000, but that's wrong. So it's basically 35,000 less than it should be. And if people don't know what I'm talking about, I mean, talk about small companies that have turnovers of less than 90,000 don't have to register for VAT. So they don't have to charge 20% VAT on all their goods. Now that figure should be 125,000. So companies that have got a turnover between 90 and 125,000 have been caught in this net of having to charge VAT when they shouldn't be. It should be free. And so this is having a terrible effect on small companies. And you're right, unfortunately. And yeah, the minimum wage is something else. I mean, because you see, the thing is, it doesn't cost the government any money. So they just say to companies, you've got to pay your staff more. And it doesn't cost them anything. And they just pass a law. And businesses, it suffers. And like you say, small businesses suffer worse because they can afford the wages less.
Right. We're going to go to Robert Jenrick. He wrote a particularly good article in this week's Telegraph, Weekend Telegraph. And I want to go into this in detail because it is very, very important. Of course, he was in charge of all things immigration before he said, I've had enough, Rishi, I'm off. I've done my best. I see the problem. You're not listening. Right, he said, a cap on net migration has to be less than 100,000 a year. Why does he say this? Well, if you look at the statistics, it's mind-boggling what's happened. If you look at the statistics in the last 25 years, up to Tony Blair's election, I might add, cumulative net migration before that was 68,000 a year. In the next 25 years to 2022, it was nearly 6 million, almost 100 times the previous 25 years. Now, this is mega, and it's not just Blair. It was the Tory incumbents after Blair that were equally culpable. He kicked the thing off, but everybody followed on various precepts, the main one being we're desperate for growth. We have to get growth going. We have to get people to look after our own people in homes. None of our own people want to do that. We've got to let people in. Well, I'll give you some facts and figures here. Yes, 745,000 in 2022. Right, that's just the start of things, Sid. There are far too many migrants coming in, and they've got in by saying, look, we bring in value for money. They don't. This has come out in the last 12 months. By the time they've brought in their relations, etc., they are costing the economy an absolute fortune. It is not positive immigration that it's always been lauded. In fact, he goes and says, Mr. Jenrick, the Tory party, and don't forget he's Tory, has just put two fingers up at the British public for liberalising the immigration system, breaking their promises on leaving the EU to take control of Britain's borders. He's absolutely right. The other thing is that we've got to look at, it is not, he said, rocket fuel, as I've just mentioned, to make wages rise, to make the economy better. Quite the reverse. And he's proved it. And he's backed up by economists. The average has been 1.2% a year, which is half of the rate for the last 4 decades of growth. And he even cites the fact that if immigrants come in from, as an example, Poland, Philippines, or New Zealand, they are 50% more likely to be in work than the immigration at the moment, mainly African, of course, from Somalia and Bangladesh. These are not quality people.
Well, yeah.
The last thing he says, which is vitally important over this period, everybody says we need 6,000 foreign social care workers. The true figures are imported have been 250,000 migrants, especially for social care working. That is criminal, and no wonder that with that jaw-dropping stat, you can't argue against it. It's a mess.
Yeah, we have to be clear. We're talking about two different things here. One thing is asylum seekers, who are generally illegal immigrants, who are coming over in boats. And the other thing is people who are coming here with visas, totally legally, but the government have granted them visas. And sometimes people will overstay their visa. Other times they're here perfectly legally, they've renewed their visa, whatever, which is actually quite expensive, but obviously they're still counted in the immigrant figures. Now, the first thing is obviously the illegal immigrants. That system is massively abused because the only reason for the asylum system is for people that are fleeing wars or famine and are literally their life is in danger. And nobody coming over here from France has got their life in danger in France. I mean, so there should be no immigration from France into the UK. The problem is that the French authorities don't want these people in France, so they're only too pleased to help them move into the UK. But that's got to stop. It's got to be stopped one way or another. As far as the legal immigration is concerned, it really does depend on who we issue visas to, and it's up to us. I mean, I noticed when I actually went to Nigeria, it cost me £300 to apply for a visa to go to Nigeria, which really quite shocked me. And there was a very strict regime, including I had to give them a complete itinerary of exactly what I was going to do every day while I was in the country, the address of where I was staying, who I was going to stay with, and so on and so forth. And they require quite a lot of paperwork in order for me to get a visa to, and all I was doing was going to Nigeria to a wedding. That's all I was doing. I just went there. I only stayed for about 4 days and came back again. But you see, that's what the Nigerian authorities are doing. We can do the same if we want to and make it actually quite difficult for people to get visas to come to the UK. And I think we are making some changes in the sense that students that are coming here on a student visa to study are no longer being allowed to bring dependents with them, because as you say, that's a major issue. If a student comes here to study and then brings 4 or 5 people with them, then that's obviously then a burden on the state if those 4 or 5 people aren't working. So we certainly have to look at who we grant visas to, and to do it in a fair and rational manner, and so that people applying are dealt with fairly, and there's a reasonable number coming into the country and we're not being overburdened.
Let me quote you the final paragraph of this article, which is jaw-dropping, unprecedented numbers. Jenrick warned that such action, Britain faced a migration crisis that would drain public services and threaten integration. It's certainly done that. Already, said Jenrick, the housing crisis has become a migration crisis, requiring an impossible 515,000 new homes every year to cope with current levels. Now, that's appalling. It's affected everything we know, from schools to doctor surgeries and certainly house building. This is big and bad news. Let's follow it up by the fact that this very day, it's been announced that there are 5,000 and odd illegal immigrants, and they can only trace less than half of them. Now they've actually passed the law to get them to Rwanda. They can't now find them, Sid. No wonder the world is laughing at Britain.
Well, it's not just Britain, I'm afraid, it's worldwide. I mean, the figures you've quoted are far worse in Germany, for instance. I mean, they're talking about 1.25 million net migration. I mean, America's talking about millions of people coming over the border from Mexico, and Biden's got no idea who these people are that have come in. I mean, I don't think he's even bothered to track who they are. I mean, the only thing he wants is to get them to vote. I mean, he wants all illegal immigrants to be allowed to vote in the United States, and he thinks they're all going to vote Democrat. So you can come in as many as like, come in, that's great, and register to vote as soon as you can. I mean, that's his attitude. So it's not just a British problem, but it is terrible if the authorities really don't know who the people are that they've granted visas to, or where they are, or where the people are that have applied for asylum, or who they are or where they are. I mean, that is just terrible. One thing noteworthy, by the way, is the fact that very few of these migrants that are coming in illegally, I'm not talking about now about legal migration, I'm talking about illegal immigrants. Very few of them are Christians, which at first surprised me, because you'd think, well, it's Christians that are being persecuted in many countries in the world, most notably Pakistan and Syria and Nigeria and Afghanistan and all these countries. And you'd think Christians could well be fleeing from those countries to try and get to a place of safety. But it's not. It's mostly Muslims, and Muslims aren't being persecuted in their own countries. By and large, I mean, there's very few cases. I mean, there might be one or two cases in Russia or China, but the immigrants coming in aren't coming from Russia or China. So they're not coming from countries where Muslims are being persecuted, which is relatively few. So why are they coming? I mean, it seems to be almost like a deliberate attempt to increase the number of Muslims in Europe. Based on the fact they're having as many children as possible. That's all part of Islam. So I'm very, very suspicious of the whole setup, frankly.
Indeed, you mentioned other countries that maybe are worse than the UK. I don't know, because if you bring in the number of people that inhabit the States, then it's not as bad in the States, because of course they've got 350 million-ish people in the States, and there's not that many people proportionately going over the border, and that will stop if and when Trump gets in there to a large extent. We're not doing American politics today, even though it fascinates both you and I, but we're going to go to Ireland, and if you want a problem, that has snuck up on Ireland big time, immigration. And it's thanks to dear old UK. There you go. The Irish Prime Minister said, oh, my goodness me, 80% at least of the immigrants are now coming from England. It's easy to jump on a ship and get to Northern Ireland. And with this wretched border problem, well, there is no border in effect. They just walk over. And Michael Martin, Ireland's deputy prime minister, is going berserk. We don't want these asylum seekers here. Do you know what they do with them? They don't put them in hotels, Sid. They're putting them in tents. And the local population are going potty. They're burning things down. They've not got the problem that UK has got. But the local residents in Ireland protesting in the right way. Perhaps in England, we should be learning a lesson from them.
Well, one thing that very cleverly the British ministers basically said, oh, we can't negotiate directly with Ireland. We have to negotiate with the EU because this is an EU problem, because that's what France has said to us. France has said, well, we can't make an agreement with you because it's the EU. You have to make an agreement with the EU. So Ireland is now saying, oh, we want to send all these people back. And I said, oh, no, well, we'll have to discuss it with the EU. We can't make an agreement on that. So,
has Rishi played a blinder here? He doesn't often do that because basically, legally, we have every right to send these people. Let's put it the other way. I'll give you a quote. We're not going to accept, said Rishi, returns from the EU via Ireland when the EU doesn't accept returns back to France where illegal immigrants are coming from.
Yeah, totally, absolutely, totally spot on.
So we've got to give him a bit of a tick, haven't we, there?
Well, yeah, absolutely. As I say, that's basically what the minister was saying when they had a press conference with Ireland. I mean, he's basically saying, look, sorry, we can't make an agreement with you because we've been told numerous times this is an EU issue. And absolutely, I mean, if people coming here from France, we're not allowed to send them back, then how can people that go to Ireland be allowed to come back to the UK from the EU? I mean, it's completely a double standard if that was allowed. No, I mean, it's also very, very interesting that even though the Rwanda situation is not yet operating, but they're saying it's going to start operating very soon, the immigrants are now worried about coming to the UK because they might be sent to Rwanda. So that shows that the whole Rwanda policy is a policy that can be very effective.
Why do you think, Sid, while we're in Rwanda, that the Rwandans want immigrant people when such a large proportion of them have turned out to be not very nice people?
Well, they're just making money out of it, aren't they? I mean, Britain is prepared to pay Rwanda millions of pounds or dollars, whatever you want, in order to process these cases. And that's all that's happening. I mean, they're basically saying they're going to be sent there for processing. They're not saying they're being deported to Rwanda. It's just that they're being processed there.
And if but they're not going to get back into Britain, are they? Let's be honest.
Well, it's going to be very difficult, isn't it? But if Rwanda says, yes, we'll process them, and in the meantime, they get, millions of pounds and millions of dollars, then obviously it's something that's very much in their interest to do. But the actual proportion of asylum seekers or immigrants that actually come to the UK that are going to go to Rwanda is only going to be a very small proportion.
Yeah, unless they get other countries that will jump on the bandwagon, of course, which maybe they're hoping for. It's a real problem. What I'm driving at, Sid, on this, I'm not suggesting that the UK starts burning things like they've done in Ireland. But there's a very laissez-faire attitude in the UK that perhaps that's who we are now, or who we've become. We let things happen and react too late, whereas other countries, e.g. France and Ireland, say, no, we're going to stop this straight away.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it? But you see, we have a lot of people who naively just think, oh, these poor immigrants, we just got to welcome them here, and and these are people that need to be protected and helped. They haven't grasped that there's a large numbers that are economic migrants that are only coming across to the UK or to Ireland or to France, wherever they're going, in order to better themselves. They're not coming because they're fleeing a war or they're fleeing poverty. So
that's called nudging, Sid, or brainwashing in our schools. We've got the same problem here in Spain and Portugal. And as I've mentioned on the previous occasion, when I questioned the police over here, golly, there's this promenade, Paseo in Spain. It's full of Sudanese black guys selling wooden elephants and flimsy football attire. Why aren't you doing anything about it when there's notices everywhere saying you can't sell? We daren't, they say, because the people, holiday makers on the beach, including Spanish, would cause a great deal of problems for us. They would support these illegal immigrants that are into all sorts of things, including drugs. Basically, Sid, people have said, wow, 1929 was the start of cultural Marxism, and it's all part of what's going on.
Yes, I mean, yeah, you see, I think this is deliberate. I mean, there's gangs that are making enormous amounts of money over the whole migration thing. So I'm sure these gangs are actually encouraging some people to leave. But the other thing that needs to be said is that the migrants that are coming are not the most needy people in the world. I mean, people that are the most needy, that are really desperate, can't just pay some trafficker to take them across in a boat, over to France and to the UK. I mean, they haven't got the money to do it. It's only people that are relatively well off that can actually afford this economic migration. So, when people say, oh, these poor people, I mean, there's a lot poorer people in the world, let's be honest.
There are indeed. An unusual subject we've got to tackle, and that's disability and health benefits. Last year, £69 billion, and Rishi recognises the problem and has threatened to do something about it. That this will very shortly, by 2030, be at least 100 billion. That's more than our schools are costing us. And this has been put on steroids by PIP, personal independent payments. People don't want to work anymore. Some of them had a good time during the pandemic, and they've been kept by the government in various means and ways, and they don't want to go back to work. But what they do want to do is claim for health, especially depression and anxiety. And let me take you over to Knowsley, district of Liverpool. Quite famous there because they've got so many people not working, you couldn't shake a stick at it. And they're all claiming, not all, the vast majority, are going on the depression and anxiety. And to give it credit, we've got some government figures here about what you can claim for it with PIP. It's absolutely fascinating. And I'm not going to quote it all, but I'll quote some relevant things that are important. There are over 200 health conditions that you can claim for to get on the PIP list. You've got to go near the bottom where the numbers are in the hundreds to find serious diseases where people need serious help, like cancer, like heart, like pulmonary conditions. These people need help, but they're in the hundreds. Top of the list by a million miles, 368,000, in fact, are claiming PIP, depression and anxiety. Why? Because it's so easy. Oh, I feel depressed after the pandemic. Oh, I can't go out anymore. I've got agoraphobia. Whatever it is. Now, there are certain genuine claimants who have mental illness. And as we keep saying, there's nothing worse than bad mental illness because nobody feels sorry for you. They can't see a plaster on your arm or an injury or goodness knows what. A lot of people say, pull yourself together. Well, they can't. There is a proportion, but not to this proportion. What made me giggle at the end of all this lot, Sid, quite frankly, is that one particular person was highlighted for receiving PIP of £9,000 last year because he had hemorrhoids. Well, if you got off your backside, Sid, you might find work instead of hemorrhoids. And on the mental health side, of course, the finest thing for mental health is work. What a mess we're in.
Well, it's interesting. We were talking earlier about the need for carers, and we're saying, well, we've got to have immigrants because we need 6,000 carers or whatever. Well, there's very few people that can't actually work as carers, even if they've got depression, mental illness, goodness knows what. I wouldn't necessarily belittle mental illness because, as a trade unionist in the past, as I've represented people, I have come across people with stress-related illness, who can look perfectly well and perfectly normal, but they've got problems which basically mean that they're simply unable to withstand the pressure of a sales job. And a sales job can be very pressurizing. I mean, I think yourself. I mean, there's, you have a manager phoning up every day saying, what did you sell yesterday, and so on and so forth, what appointments have you made, so on and so forth. And not everyone is able to cope with that sort of pressure. But obviously, these sort of people can almost certainly work as carers because that's a much less pressurized job. I mean, so we do have to look and ask questions as to, whether some of these people that are on disability, even though they may be genuinely anxious about the job which they were doing, whether they can't do a different job, and maybe possibly the state even subsidize the new job they're doing to encourage them at least to be doing some work.
Well, can I throw another hat into the ring and say that it's not only Knowsley, it's many other areas, and they're the poorest areas of this country, but they're all Labour voting areas.
Well, yeah, but that may well be because those people, I guess, are less able to cope with the stresses and strains of life than perhaps people that are better educated and basically have got more money. If you've got more money, you can probably cope with depression and anxiety and goodness knows what than you can if you've got no money and whatever. But having said that, I mean, obviously some people do abuse the system, and some people do deliberately abuse the system, and there's no question about that. But government have got to be very, very careful, and we've got to be very careful not to tar everyone with the same brush.
Yeah, not easy, but there you go. What's happened to our young people? What do you mean, what's happened to our young? Well, they seem to be the ones that are marching pro-Palestine. They seek to be independent in lots of ways, which is a good thing, of course. But are they really? Are they part of the great brainwashing, nudging that's going on through our universities, through our schools, through our various systems? Give you an example, Sid, because they want to go back into Europe in big numbers. Now, this is very serious because coming out the woodwork, if and when Sir Keir gets in there are many clear signs now. The cat's out the bag that they want to go back into Europe. And if they get the vote of the young people, Corbyn nearly managed it, didn't he? He got the brainwashed young people. In fact, some skeptics are saying, golly, shouldn't have the vote at 16, let alone 18. It should be 25 or even 35 when you've really seen what life is all about. But the young people are important for voting, especially to Labour and especially to the EU. How can we convince them otherwise when they've been brainwashed?
Well, it's very, very difficult. I mean, all we can do is to speak the truth. A lot of the problem is the media. I mean, I had a young person said to me just recently who was a Christian who was supporting CPA, who suddenly turned around and said, I can't support CPA any longer. And it's like, why? Because you support Zionism and you're supporting Israel. Israel's engaging in genocide in Gaza. And I said, well, Israel isn't engaging in genocide. It's Hamas that believe in genocide. I actually sent her a copy of the Hamas charter, which actually calls for Jews to be killed, in their charter. And Hamas, on October the 7th, I mean, they killed all those civilians because they were Jews and for no other reason. we had the dramatic situation of one of the Palestinian terrorists who was actually phoning his father and said, "Dad, I've killed 10 Jews. Are you proud of me, Dad?" And it's like he was trained from a young age to hate Jews and to kill Jews. Israelis don't hate Arabs, and they don't deliberately kill Arabs. They're not trying to wipe Arabs off the face of the earth in the way that Hamas is trying to wipe Jews off the face of the earth. I mean, it's just complete and utter nonsense. So these people are believing lies. That's the reality of it. But as I said earlier, the truth will out. So we just have to keep speaking the truth to them. And hopefully in the end, they will get it and realize that actually this whole thing about Israel committing genocide in Gaza is just complete lies. It's totally untrue. Israel has fought this war more humanely than anybody has ever fought a war before. I mean, you talk about, for instance, the Allies, the United States and Britain, when they took Mosul back from Islamic State. I mean, the number of citizens that were killed in Mosul was way more than the number of citizens being killed in Gaza. But of course, we didn't worry about that because we were getting rid of Islamic State, and somehow getting rid of Islamic State was more important than the number of citizens being killed. But somehow, when Israel is trying to get rid of Hamas, it's like the number of civilians being killed is of overwhelming importance and vastly exaggerated, with lies being told, so on and so. It is. I think it's just anti-Semitism, frankly.
Yep. Quickly, before we have to take our leave, I'm going to mention Heathrow Airport. It's lost its status as a major hub. Now, I know your party have been saying that you want something east of London for a long while in the Thames estuary. Basically, with all the pantomime about planning permission, about a third runway, it's been taken off them and gone to the continent. This is going to cost the country millions, even billions in the long run.
Yeah, that's right. And a lot of people don't understand that we need a major hub airport. And if people don't know what that means, it basically means if somebody's flying, for instance, from New York to Copenhagen, you can't get a flight from New York to Copenhagen. So you get a flight from New York to Heathrow, and you get a flight from Heathrow to Copenhagen. And people aren't going to fly into Heathrow and then get a train to Gatwick and fly from Gatwick to Copenhagen. It's not going to happen. So if it's easier to fly to Paris and Paris to Copenhagen, they'll do that. Because obviously there's flights going from New York to Paris, and everything is also competitively priced. So if Paris prices themselves to be more competitive than Heathrow, then that's an advantage. But the problem that Heathrow's got, which anyone that's flown into Heathrow knows, is that when you try to land in Heathrow, you end up going round and round in circles, waiting for a landing spot, and you're probably at least half an hour going round in circles, waiting for a landing spot to land. So Heathrow is now too small an airport to be the major hub airport that it was. So we need a new airport. We need a new airport in the Thames estuary that will have 6 runways. It'll be a massive airport, and you can also fly during the night because you'll be flying over water. So you won't have a situation which you've got in Heathrow where you can't fly after a certain time because because you can't have flights over houses in the middle of the night. So Heathrow's got all these restrictions, and expanding Heathrow is not the answer. Having a new airport in the east of London is the answer. Without a shadow of doubt, it's the answer. We know it's the answer. It's just having the will to do it. But as I've said before, the way we can do it is by getting money off all these quangos, which are 65 billion overspent per year. If you take some of that 65 billion, it only costs about 20-odd billion to build a new airport. The expensive part will be building all the motorways and the railways up to the airport. That's what will cost the money, but we can do it without a shadow of doubt. And if we stop spending money on quangos and spent it on a new airport in the east of London, it will bring an enormous amount of business into the UK, enormous amount. And like you're saying, we're losing a lot of business now because we haven't grabbed the bull by the horns. Boris Johnson was talking about this when he was Mayor of London, and I'm sure if he continued as Mayor of London, would have done it. Sadiq Khan is absolutely hopeless. I mean, he's achieved nothing as mayor of London.
No, but he's going to get back in because we have only got 37% of the capital's occupants as being born white and British. It's dreadful. No other capital in any country in the world can get anywhere near that figure. And Sadiq Khan, who's been an absolute disaster, is going to get back in again unless a miracle happens. We're not going to discuss him at the moment. We're going to move swiftly on. But by thinking finally of the airport and planning, I see roads on the continent, motorways, being built and used in 2.5 years over difficult terrain. It's not flat. It demands bridges, viaducts, aqueducts, the whole lot, and tunnels. And the only reason is that they've not got the bureaucracy and committees that we have in the United Kingdom. It's diabolical. Can I illustrate this by one simple, infuriating thing when we used to live in the south of England? And that was the Hazelmere bypass there. And it took 30 years to put a bypass in because of a tree squirrel that looked like a little rat. 30 years, every year 14 people died at the big crossing there just outside Hazelmere. How many lives is that over 30 years, Sid? That is a disgrace, and it's typical about why nothing happens in GB, sadly. But we're going to move on lastly and very rapidly to the real crux of things perhaps this week. But is it? I regard it as pantomime, as a comedy. Of course, Humza springs to mind, and Scotland. What a mess they made of it from the Wicked Witch of the North that was clearly in the wrong job at the wrong time, that was clearly nationalistic out of her mind. And now her husband's going to be got, as we mentioned last week. Is he the fall guy? Who knows? And now Hamza has had to go. And it's going to be interesting, fascinating. Is the Christian Kate going to do something, or is she too nationalistic? She's got some good ideas, and she's not backing down on certain things, Sid.
No, her problem is that she's not acceptable to the Greens. You have to remember that this issue cropped up because Humza Yousaf was not willing to accept the Greens' demand for easy sex change, easy gender change. I mean, what they call self-ID. So you can just say one day I'm a woman and the next day I'm a man, and no one's going to ask any questions. That's self-ID. And see, the Greens are incredibly woke. And Humza Yousaf, being a radical Muslim, didn't like this at all. And to begin with, he was willing to play along with it. But in the end, he basically said, I've had enough of this, no more. And that's the main reason why the Greens pulled out of the coalition. Yeah, you have to remember that. So if a Christian comes along and leads the SNP, that's not going to be acceptable at all to the Greens. So I think the person who's most likely to lead the SNP now is going to be John Sweeney, who was a deputy before. Last time he said, no, I'm not interested in standing. This time he said, yes, I am interested. So I think he'll almost certainly get it because he's the person with the most status and he's more likely to be acceptable to the Greens. But I think, frankly, they all need voting out. In Scotland, people should vote for the Scottish Family Party. And Kate Forbes, if she was sensible, would go and join the Scottish Family Party and stand for them and stand for something she really believes in, not something that she's going along with. Christians have got to stand for what they really believe in politics, because that's the place of where God's blessing is, and that's the place of progress.
It's sad, isn't it, when you think of the capability of Scotland? I mean, the best of the Scots are the best of everything that is laudable. Education, they were top of the tree with education, their universities, the law. And this madness, again, it started off by the Greens, has put them bottom of the list with the NHS, with everything you can think about. It's a disaster. Bona fide political parties come and go. Some stay forever, and perhaps they shouldn't. But if you analyse things, Sid, greed and power destroy nations. Classic example. That's what's done about the Scots. There was no mention of nationalism to the extent it is now before the North Sea with all its wealth came along. Coincidence, do you think?
I honestly don't know, but yes, I do agree that Alex Salmond was very strong on Scottish oil. This is Scottish oil wealth to Scotland, but the reality is that Scotland is subsidised by London effectively, because there's an enormous amount of wealth created in London, which goes throughout the whole of the UK. I mean, so no, I mean, it's this idea that somehow Scotland will be better off independent is nonsense. But all this stuff about Scotland wanting to stay in the EU is also complete nonsense, because Scotland somehow getting favourable treatment from its second largest market, namely the EU, but cutting itself off from its largest market, which is the United Kingdom, is just utter economic nonsense.
Well, there you go. We've not even had we've not had time to talk football, Sid, this week. So things are really hotting up on the political front. I know they are for you. We wish you well in the next elections, and we'll discuss that, the local elections, next week, and see if that really is an indicator to our next government. Some people will just dismiss it. Some people, and I guess a lot, will not even bother turning out this year more than any previous year. They're fed up with everyone. And I'll give you the last word, Sid, because you have found that on the doorstep, haven't you? People are just almost saying, I'm punch drunk. What can I do about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on the doorstep, there's not an enormous amount of hostility against the Conservative government, but there is an enormous amount of disillusion with politics in general. People are saying, I've had enough. This government is useless. They haven't done what we wanted in terms of Brexit. They haven't done what we wanted in terms of controlling our borders. They've been pathetic. But, if we have Labour back in, they're going to, like you say, probably take us back into the EU. And they're just thinking, I've had enough. I'm fed up with all of this. I can't think about it anymore. I'm not going to bother to vote. And we're getting that reaction an awful lot on the doorstep. I wish the CPA had enough candidates so that we were standing everywhere, because I tell you, the way things are going, our policies are absolutely the answer to the nation. But that's we'll wait to see whether we can be a force.
Bless you, Sid. We look forward to seeing you next week.